James Sheehan of History, the Dickinson Professor in the Humanities, here to talk to us about teaching a freshman-sophomore seminar. And we are very grateful, Jim, that you would tackle this because with every Stanford freshman and sophomore now potentially being able to take a seminar, this kind of course now represents a significant slice of the pedagogy at Stanford. Professor Sheehan is himself a product of Stanford, if I can use that somewhat commercial-sounding term, since he received his A.B. from the farm in 1958. He then very broad-mindedly crossed the bay to the University of California, Berkeley, where he completed both a master's and a PhD, the latter in 1964. Now, for 2 years before he completed the PhD, he was an instructor at Stanford. But once he had it in hand, he accepted an assistant professorship at Northwestern University and spent 15 years there, becoming a full professor after only 8 years, and winning 2 teaching prizes there. And I'll have a little bit more to say about teaching awards in a moment. In 1979, Stanford lured Jim back to campus, and fortunately for us, he has remained here, becoming the Dickinson Professor in 1986. Now, anyone in 19th or 20th century German or European history knows that Jim is a prolific and distinguished scholar. He is the author or editor of 8 books and over 30 journal articles or book chapters, in addition to hundreds of book reviews and shorter pieces. He has also won just about every distinction that a humanist can win, including, for example, fellowships with the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Wolfson College at Oxford, the Wissenschaft Kolleg in Berlin, and others that I could name. He also spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. He is a Humboldt Research Prize winner. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society and a fellow of both the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also of the Royal Historical Society. And again, I could name a few others, but in the interest of time and not to make Jim blush, I won't. And as I mentioned before, Jim has given devoted attention to teaching. Besides the 2 prizes at Northwestern University, he has also won 2 teaching awards here on campus, the H&S Award for Distinguished Teaching and the University of Owen-Wide Award, the Gores Award for Excellence in Teaching. And as if that weren't enough, he has also been an extremely conscientious university citizen. He's chaired his department 3 times. He's been a member and also chair of the advisory board and chair and vice chair of the faculty senate. But perhaps his most important university service was when he chaired the Commission on Undergraduate Education from 1993 to 94, since the report of that commission has had much to do with shaping Stanford undergraduate education in the last decade. And I'd actually like to read one quote from that report, which came almost at its end, and it is a quote from Jonathan Cole of Columbia, who asked, "Is it possible in the highly competitive world of research universities to produce faculty members who are among the most distinguished in the world in terms of their productivity and who will devote sufficient time and energy to teaching, particularly teaching undergraduates?" And thanks to Jim and his career, we can say a resounding yes to that question. Thank you so much, Professor Sheehan.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Now, am I ready? Yes, okay. Thank you, Michelle. I must say, it was really kind of an overwhelming introduction. And I hope you'll be available to introduce me at all future events. Because, always feel at the end of that, it's a mistake to go on. That it's got to go downhill from this moment. Well, Michelle mentioned this Commission on Undergraduate Education, and I must say one of the clearest things we learned there was how important the Center for Teaching and Learning was. It was really one of the pioneers in this area, and it is, I think, extremely important for Stanford, both as an indication of the fact that we take teaching seriously, but also as a way of working on teaching in a variety of ways. And there are lots of reasons for the success of the center. One of them, I think, is right here to my left. But another is, I think the center recognizes that while there are lots of theories of teaching and learning, that in fact teaching and learning is always embedded in quite specific circumstances. It means quite different things in psychology, in history, in mathematics, different problems, different opportunities, and indeed that there are different issues that surround different kinds of courses. I'm always very uneasy about defining people as good or sometimes not so good teachers, because it seems to me that there are very often people who are very good teachers at certain kinds of things and maybe less good at others. And we ought to recognize this variety as well as the specificity. All of that is a way of telling you what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, and that is I'm going to talk about a course. I don't have any really very interesting generalizations about how to teach a course at one of these introductory seminars. I do have an experience with teaching some of them, and that's really what I want to base my remarks on. First of all, though, a word about how I see this particular format. What makes these introductory seminars different from the other kinds of courses? Well, I think that there are three things. First, it seems to me that these courses, while they obviously have a content, they have a substantive base, all I think have and should have what we might call a methodological set of aspirations. That is, they all ought to introduce students not simply to a subject matter, but to a particular way or a variety of ways of looking at the world. And I think this methodological aspiration is one of the things that gives this kind of an introduction, makes it different from, let us say, the kind of Econ 1, History 1, 2, 3 kind of introductory courses that most of us in one department or another have. The second distinguishing feature of these introductory seminars, it seems to me, is that they are collaborative ventures. They are not simply the matter of transmitting knowledge, but they ought to, in one way or another, involve the mutual creation of knowledge. They ought to help students to understand what the university in its essence is all about, which is both the transmission and the creation of knowledge. Clearly, in most fields, this is going to involve a lot of compromises. It's very unlikely that freshmen are going to go into somebody's lab and begin to mess around with the equipment, at least not freely and unsupervised. Nonetheless, however difficult it might be to filter through the limitations of the format, it does seem to me there ought to be a creative, collaborative element. And the third thing, and it flows, I think, from the first two, is I think that the seminars ought to be linked in some way with the advising process. The thing that came out, another thing that came out very clearly from this Commission on Undergraduate Education was that among the many things we did, advising was not one of the ones we did particularly well. And it also was clear that this is true virtually everywhere. Virtually every university that has ever surveyed its undergraduates has found deep levels of dissatisfaction with advice. Well, I don't know how many of you have been advisors. I've served my time, and I'm a lapsed advisor at the moment, but I may go back. But I always found it there was a randomness to advising that I always found very difficult. I sometimes thought it was a little bit like computer dating. I've never done that, but that's imagine computer dating to do, where you kind of randomly get matched up with somebody, and maybe it works, but most likely it's not going to. And I thought there was this random quality that made advising always a difficult, contingent thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it didn't. Well, I think the introductory seminar is a way of taking some of that randomness out and creating among students very early on a basis for sharing, a basis for a common enterprise. And so in thinking about these and trying to make them work, I think this effort to create these sorts of relationships ought to play some sort of a role. It's methodological. It is collaborative, and in this sense it is then meant to have, and in some cases I think does have, some sort of long-term effects on the relationship between faculty and students. Okay, with that brief introduction, let me talk about this course. I was looking for a subject that had the following characteristics. It ought to be interesting, more or less immediately so. There are lots of things that I'm interested in that might or might not attract your average 18 or 19-year-old. And so it had to be something that would have an immediate intrinsic interest. It had to be something about which there was a lot of source material, because as you'll see, built into this course is a lot of experience with primary sources. But have a lot of source material. The source material had to be in English, which for a European historian is not always a trivial matter. And finally, it ought to be a subject that had a rich enough historical literature that I could create an interplay between the source material and the ways in which it had been interpreted. Now that'll become clear when I show you what the course was in fact about. Well, the subject that occurred to me, and there are lots of them in a wonderfully rich field like history, but the subject that occurred to me was the First World War. That it is something I think that a lot of people in one way or another are interested in. They know a little something about, not a lot perhaps, but a little something about it, and they are drawn to it. They come with it. They come to it then with at least some degree of interest. And of course there are buffs who know more about the battles and weapons of the war certainly than I do. And so I chose the First World War, but not the war as a whole, because that would have been much too much for a 9-week course. I chose a particular aspect of the war. I chose the problem of what it was like to fight that war in the most, if not strategically the most important, culturally the most resonant part of the war, and that was, of course, the Western Front. What was the experience? What was it like to be there? And connected with that, how was this experience remembered? How did this experience then get passed into the way people thought about, memorialized, and considered the war? And of course, as you're all already thinking, the big question is, what's the relationship between these two? What's the relationship between what we can find out about the immediacy of the experience and the way in which that experience is transmuted, as experiences always are for us as individuals, as for societies, transmuted into some kinds of private and public memory? This process of transmutation, of transference, recreation, creation, which is that process that I really most of all wanted to get the students to think about. It is a complicated and subtle and elusive set of issues, and I can't say. I mean, I'll give you my own grade on the course at the end, but I can't say that I was fully successful at this. I began the course by giving them an example of the difficulty of getting at experience, and I showed them on the very first day that we got together a series of maps. I'm not going to give you a lecture on the First World War. It's tempting, but I will resist. So I give them that map, which is and then I show them that map, which is a map of the area. And then I showed them this map, which is a map of the network of trenches. You can see each of these gets a little more complicated, a little more specific. The first, very schematic, very encoded. The second, a little closer, and then ended with this, which, of course, is the way it looked if you were there. Not lines, not blocks, but mud, water. And even though this picture is in its own way quite vivid, it doesn't include what would have been one of the most apparent and overwhelming experiences, which is how it smelled, without really being able to take a deep breath and knowing what that particular part of the universe smelled like. You're still a long way away from grasping what it was about. So I started this way. The only day I lectured in this course at all was the first one. The only time I talked more than 3 or 4 minutes. But tried to do it in a way that got them thinking about the need to penetrate beyond the conventional representation of reality in a map, say, which is a classic sort of representation, necessary, accurate or not, but still a distance from reality, to get them thinking about the way in which we have to use these maps, but if possible, move beyond them. Okay, so here's the course. Now, the first thing I tried to do, the first reading, was a problem. And as it turned out, a mistake. Because I wanted a book that would give me that would in a way bring everybody in the class up to the same level. There were some people there who knew a lot. Some people there who knew virtually nothing. So I wanted a book that would provide a sort of historical basis. But as all of you, or many of you, will know, publishers don't always cooperate in these ventures, because the book I wanted was immediately declared out of print. And I had to find as quickly as I could a substitute. And I chose this book by Dennis Winter, which is a perfectly good book. It's not a book that did what I wanted it to do. It was a much too diffuse. It was not that kind of synthesis, that foundational synthesis that I was looking at. And in some ways, that blighted the whole course. I mean, as you know, courses are like chess games. The first moves are very, very important. And, you know, we recovered it. But if this had been a better book, I think it would have been a better source. I also, and I would recommend to everybody teaching one of these to do this, I also gave them a written assignment the very first week. You can see it's a written assignment here that asked them really to make a statement about what the course was about. And I used this sort of hokey PBS producer thing. I don't know whether that worked or not. But in any case, the purpose of this assignment was to get them to think about the course as a whole before they'd taken it, to give me an example of their written work so I could immediately diagnose those people who had writing problems. And you wouldn't be surprised to learn that there are people at Stanford who have these problems. But not least important, to give them a kind of benchmark, an opportunity to think what they thought the course was about, so that at the end of the course they could look back on this first paper and give some sense of progress. I have, in fact, in the past, I didn't do it this time, I have in the past asked them to rewrite their first paper, to give them a first paper like this, and ask them to rewrite it at the end in order to give some sense of the arc, the pedagogical arc across which they've traveled. The other thing I did the second meeting was I formed them into research groups, working groups. I am a great admirer of the working group. I divided them. It was a class of 15. I divided them into 4 groups. I let them divide themselves. You know, some of them went with people in their dorms, and there's always a kind of residue that you've got to put together. But that's fine. So we had 4 working groups, and their assignment was to produce, for the last 2 sessions, you're down here, a research project that would have individual elements in it, but would be combined in some way to make a presentation. I did this for several reasons. And again, as you'll see, there's both an intellectual and a pedagogical and a kind of socializing ingredient in all of this. As I had them form these working groups because I wanted them to begin thinking about the course collectively outside of the discussion. I wanted them to get accustomed to the creation of knowledge by doing some sort of a small independent research project. But I wanted them to do that together in ways that had to be coordinated. I mean, they learned a lot. One of the things some of them learn, of course, is what the economists call the free rider problem, because everybody in these groups do not do the same amount of work, but that's fine. The other thing about this is that these groups, because of the very nature of the project, the very open-ended quality, and at first they don't really know what to do and how to do it and so forth, requires them to come to see me. Requires, and in fact I schedule special office hours in the course of this, requires that they come, and they come as a group. And I think that's very valuable at first, particularly for freshmen. I think they're much more confident, much more willing to talk, and all of us get together as a group, and we try to figure out how they can operate. And I think in some ways that function, that pedagogical function, works better with a group of 4 than it does one-on-one. So their job then is from the very start to think about doing some kind of a research project, which they then work on in the course of the course. Okay. How long do you want me to speak? Okay. Well, I don't think that's too long. Maybe I'll stop because people want to hear questions. So you can then see how the course works. It's divided into, after this not very successful introductory reading, it's divided then into 3 parts. 1, a series of sources, primary sources. Then 2 interpretations, and then finally the group projects. So let me say a little bit, something about each of these. I begin the sources with the most immediate things I can find. That is somebody's diary. Somebody's diary that was written. And of course, you always have to wonder about diaries. When you write a diary, do you really think it's just for you, or is it for somebody else? Is it going to go out somewhere else? So lots of interesting questions about diaries. But the diary, the day-by-day diary, is as close as I could get. If we read another sense of sources, you might be able to get some action reports from various military things, although these are hard to read. So I used diaries. Then I used autobiographies that were published at the time. Of soldiers, yeah. People on the Western Front. These are all people in the trenches. Mainly English, but some German, but mainly English because of the language. I ended this autobiographical section with some poems. Now, I'll tell you, if you want to be absolutely sure you're going to have a good discussion, I guarantee it. There's just no way out. You take a group of people and you have them talk about poetry. First thing you have them do, have them read the poems aloud. They love it. And they read, some of them who haven't spoken, and those are the ones you kind of encourage maybe to be among the first readers, turn out to read remarkably well. And they get to hear their own voice, and that, of course, empowers them. And then, of course, another great thing about talking about poems, these are poems written by soldiers at the time of the war, is that it is a small enough source that it is comprehensible. You can see it. It's right there in front of you. And you can all see it. You can all see the whole thing. And, of course, it's extremely interesting to find out how difficult it is to read these things and to see what they say. And I have a series of poems from different stages of the war that trace the changes in the sensibility. And it's quite remarkable to see some of these young males, who are interested in the war because they're fascinated by the origins of the tank, get taken away and really swept up by some of this poetry. And I mix some not so good poetry with some quite great poetry and try to see if they can tell the difference. I always ask them, what their favorite is, and if they get it wrong, it's a big mistake. So then, we start with the diaries produced at the time, and then we get to the autobiographies, which were published in the course of the war. We get to the poems, which were written at the time. Then we're moving a little further, although we're still in one way or another dealing with immediate experience. We're dealing with Remarks, All Quiet on the Western Front. It's a book that many of them have read, but I think many of them, and this is always wonderful pedagogically, many of them have misread it because they've read it as they've been taught it as an anti-war novel. Well, it is an anti-war novel in a way, but it's also a pro-soldier novel. It is a celebration of the military experience as well as a lamentation about the horrors of war. And very much, I think, part of a certain attitude that begins to come into play. And then we read Robert Graves' is probably the most famous autobiography to come out, at least of the English side. Robert Graves' Goodbye to All. Very problematic book written well after the war, a book that has, as all great writers, a sense of immediacy and plausibility, but also when you begin to look at it carefully, not all that different in its fictionalization as some of the things in Remark. And it's an interesting conversation going to talk about here this book that is proposed to be an autobiographical statement of truth and a novel that is supposed to be fiction. What is in fact the relationship between these sorts of things and the experiences they're meant to represent? Well, this is the kind of problem that historians face all the time. This is the sort of stuff we try to tease the truth out of. And then I had them read, at the end now, two, I think, very great books. John Keegan's Face of Battle, which is a book that is an effort to recreate the nature of battle. Not why one side won or lost, but what it was like to be there at Agincourt, Waterloo, and the Somme. And I had them read the chapter on the Somme, and the last chapter, which reflects on the meaning of this and the problem of, is the age of battle over? A question that perhaps was more open when Keegan read the book than it is now. Keegan uses, and that's one of the reasons why he fits nicely into this, Keegan uses some of the sources that they've already read. So they get a sense now of seeing the sources that they've grappled with being used by a master historian, someone who has really worked extremely hard to get as close as he possibly can. And of course, you've got to ask the question, how close does he get? How successful is it, and why? Where's Keegan stand in all of this? Where's Keegan's position? What is his attitude? Where does he come from? Nothing, of course, is transparent. Nothing is simply a window through which we look at the facts. And then the last source is, I suppose, the book that inspires the course as a whole, Paul Fussell's book, The Great War and Modern Memory, which is a very sophisticated, complex account of the course's core purpose, memory and experience. And Fussell, like Keegan, even more than Keegan, in fact, talks about a lot of the things that we've read together. Talks about the poems, talks about Graves, talks about these things, and does it in a very sophisticated literary way. And if they get Keegan, if they get Fussell, they get the core of the course. I mean, if they can read Fussell and understand what he's talking about, they have gotten really the point. Do they do it? Well, we live in hope, and some of them surely do. Some of them I'm not so sure. Some of them I think it may be just asking a little more than they're willing or able to do. And then we come to the group projects. So we have 4 groups. Each one gets an hour. We gather. They're told to be encouraged to be as creative as possible, but no more so. And in fact, some of these are quite wonderful. I remember one, I'm not sure it was this year, maybe in the year before, where they put on a dinner table conversation in an English family between somebody who's about to leave from the front and his sister who's not sure she wants him to go, and his father, the father who reflects a kind of traditional patriotism, and the mother who's concerned about both of her children. It was a really quite wonderful realization of a lot of the themes of the course. Others go over to the Hoover and find one of them found a book of love letters from a Stanford student to her fiancé who was going over, and so she kind of talked about that. So there are lots of some people one person did a kind of a hospital scene. So there were, and then of course I'll draw a veil across some of the ones that were perhaps a little too creative. As I remember, there was a secret weapon presentation that was not entirely a success. But I mean, they learn from, like the rest of us. They learn from their mistakes. My impression is that they really very much enjoy doing this. That they like working together. They compete. They like the sense that they're in this team, that they're competing with other teams. They like the sense that they get a chance to take over and have an hour to fill. So I think that is something that if I were to do this again, I would certainly do again. It also, I think, has the effect of making the discussions before that much better, because it creates within each discussion a group of people who've gotten to know one another outside of class and who've gotten to talk outside of class about the class. So you're not really creating a pedagogical community afresh every time you get together. And I have them write a paper on this merely because since I have to give them grades, it's I think would be extremely difficult to grade these group projects because, as I said, there is the free rider problem, and there is also the sometimes a misplaced ambition problem and so forth. So it's I think necessary to have that final piece of written work to level out the evaluations. Okay. Well, I mean, I was talking to Gordon before. I said, here I'm giving you a history of a course, right? And what historians do, of course, is make things much more orderly than they in fact were. You've heard it sounded like I was planning it all the way, and it was all kind of worked out the way. Well, it's entirely true. And I would say, to be absolutely honest, that it was a course that I think almost everybody enjoyed. I think everybody liked to come to class. I think it was a course that did engage people's interest. It was, I think, it did have it was a course in which I think I saw at least a third of the students several times in the course of the next 3 years they were. I wasn't here 1 year, so I saw a third of the students several times well after the course, and a couple of them became quite officially advisees. So I think the advising function of these courses did work. I have to be honest to tell you that the content was a little thinner than I would have liked. I would have wished that there was some more beef in the course. It wasn't because I didn't give them enough to read. It wasn't because they didn't work hard enough. It was just that the whole enterprise made it a little harder for me to get them to learn quite as much about the war as I would have liked. So it was a trade-off. I'm not sure that I could figure out how to pack more content in it without distracting from some of these other aspects. But it was not without that sense, at least on my part, and maybe on some of theirs, a sense that I wish that maybe there'd been a little more. Maybe we needed. Well, that would be my qualification. Okay. Why don't I stop and let you ask some questions? Please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a sticky question about the brass tacks of grades, since you mentioned grading the papers of the students.
Mm-hmm.
Many of the Frostoff seminars are offered credit, no credit. Yours seems to have been one where they did get a grade.
Yep.
Why did you elect to have it the graded one, and why would somebody elect to offer the credit, no credit choice? And what can you expect from students when you do offer the credit, no credit choice?
The question was, thank you. The question was, why did I offer it for a grade, and what are the expectations that would lead one to offer it for a grade, or to lead one to offer it pass, no credit? Well, I would have trouble, I think, defining what a pass would be in a course like this. Or maybe better said, I would have trouble defining what a no credit would be. And so I would fear, from my own kind of conservative perspective, I would fear that in fact a pass no credit is an abolition of the grades entirely. Now that might be possible, it might even be a good idea, but I would worry as I looked at these 15 students who were taking calculus and chemistry and psychology 1 and so forth, where they were in fact getting grades. I would be a little worried that in that pedagogical economy by which students decide to allocate their time, that I might not come out ahead. That would worry me. I mean, let's face it, you know, there are really only a couple of grades around, right? There are A's and B's, and you give a C and the sky darkens. So it's not as though, you know, it's not as though we're going into some sort of a highly punitive system. Nonetheless, I mean, the grading, it seems to me, does help to protect the course from imperialistic intrusions by places where grading is important. But it also, I think, helps to indicate that I take this very seriously. That this is something that I care a lot about, and I expect them to care. I don't expect them to take this course. But if they sign on, I expect them to care. I do not tolerate people not turning in their paper. I do not tolerate people not coming to class. So I mean, I make very, very firm expectations, of which grading is in some way, we might wish it weren't, but is in some way a symbolic expression. Gordon.
How do you guarantee that they read what you ask them to talk?
Well, there is this second brief paper, which has one of its functions to ensure that in every section there are some who not only read, but read carefully. But it becomes quickly clear in the discussion, you know, who has read and who hasn't. And there'll be some people who are shy and who are reluctant to speak. But I don't think it's hard to tell who's read the work and who hasn't.
What do you do?
Well,
Either do some grouping up.
Oh. Well, I don't remember anybody in this class. I mean, I have, but you know, we all have students who goof off, and In seminars, I do talk to them. I do tell them that that I don't really think they're doing the work. In lecture courses, they don't come to lecture. That's their problem. It's not my tuition money. So but I think in this where it really does depend, where it is a collective, collaborative venture, I think, and this is true of all colloquia and seminars, I try my best. Sometimes I frown. I think I can. No, I won't. I know. I mean, I can lower the room temperature a bit, I think. But the difficulty is there's a limited amount you can do, and as we all know, we've all had disruptive students, I think, or many of us have, and it's very, very hard to deal with this because, of course, as much as the class may hate this character, they will join with him against you if you go against, they will turn against if you try to be too harsh. So it's a good question. It's a difficult one. Yes, ma'am.
I wonder if you tell us more about what happens in your class meetings, because seminars is a specific pedagogy, a different process from the lecture, for example, and you talked about knowledge building and relationship building, so I wonder what happens.
Great, good. Thank you. That's an excellent question. I do not lecture. I mean, I do not. I come in with a series of questions in my mind. Not really so much a set agenda, but a series of questions. I try to begin with questions it seems to me everybody could answer, and then move deeper and deeper into the material. I mean, these are all text-based discussions, right? Everybody has a copy of the text. And so my questions always lead us into the text, and often by asking us to look at quite specific passages. So I try to ask, and this is what makes seminar leading an art and lecture giving a craft. I mean, there is a kind of, there is a sense that you try to get of feeling how the conversation flows. You've got to try to think a couple of questions ahead. Doesn't always work. There is, of course, always the dangers had me that one of the first times I ever taught many, many years ago, where somebody answers all the questions you've got prepared in one long paragraph, right? And you've got 108 minutes left. So, right? What do? Well, actually, of course, the only thing to do is you ignore it completely and just go on. Pretend you hadn't said anything. But I mean, the text has to engage them, right? I mean, that's the key. That is to try to get them to read this carefully. And to see how much more there is there than often they originally thought. To go back to the poems, that's why these are such wonderful pedagogical tools, right? Because you can simply say, well, what's this mean? Well, it's not so clear, right? That everybody will know what it means. And then you'll say, well, no, what about this? How do you read it this way? And they will come out of it seeing that if you read carefully and if you bring to it not only a vigorous desire to analyze, but a certain amount of information, you can see things about the world you would not otherwise see. That's what teaching seems to me. If we have to one single thing to say about teaching generally, that ought to be it. You see the world as you would not have seen it otherwise. And the text is the way I try to do that. I wish I could say more about these questions and how I do it, but I don't. It's not something I can verbalize. Michelle,
Follow up on that a little bit. You talk about pedagogical community.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the things you do to help foster that, and how do you know when you've got one?
Well, the question was talked about a pedagogical community. How do you foster it? How do you know you've got one? Well, the last question, I think, is the easiest. I mean, you know you've got one when people come in and are participating in the enterprise. When they have accepted the ground rules, which are to do the reading, to talk about it in an informed way, to talk, if possible, to one another, to differ, if possible, with one another, but to do it respectfully. So that's how you know you've got one. How you create it? Well, I mean, I try to create it by, first of all, not lecturing myself, not letting them think that I'm going to get them out of it, and let them try to get them to know from the very start that this is their class. I mean, I have in my life listened to silence for longer than was comfortable, and waited, for somebody to say something. It's not easy, as we all know, but it's a way of showing them that this is theirs. I do think these working groups are a wonderful way of fostering a sense of community, because they create relationships, but they also take the class outside of the classroom in a way that is not simply somebody sitting in a library reading a book, but a group of people sitting in a dorm somewhere talking about what they're going to do, talking about the course. And I think they bring that back into the classroom, and that helps to create this sort of sense of cooperation. There are always going to be some who will not join. There are always going to be non-members. So I don't want to give you a sense that this is was by any means unanimous. But I think in a class of 15, I would say a good dozen were part. Yes, please.
What do you see as specific to freshmen and sophomores in this?
Specific to the what do I see specific as seminar? Well, as I said at the beginning, it seems to me that it does have a methodological aspiration. That is, it should try to introduce people not simply to a body of thought, but to a way of thinking. And it ought to, if possible, do this in a way that is active and collaborative rather than passive and receptive. Yes, please.
You said that you did spend more time the first meeting of the course setting things up, and I was wondering, were you actually very explicit about your pedagogical goals when you were laying things out? Did you actually talk at all about building a community, or did you just kind of let that be?
Well, I'm not sure that I talked about it. Quick question. Question was, how explicit was I about my goals in the first section? Well, I'm not sure that I used the word community. I'm not sure that I certainly wasn't as explicit as I've been this afternoon. I did talk about what I expected. I tried to give them a sense of what I expected. And I tried to give them a sense of what the course was going to be about. But I don't think, I'm quite sure that I didn't give them this larger framework. Might have been a good idea, although I think students have to realize things rather than simply be told. I mean, if it were just really a matter of telling them, I think Michelle's center would be out of business, right? It's not just a matter of telling them. It's somehow, as in a novel, it's showing them and getting them to see. And maybe I should have been more explicit, and I thank you for that. I'll think more about that. But I tried to get them to realize it by what I was doing. Yes, of course.
How did you, what control did you have on what the topics were for these group projects? And did you suggest that to them? Or give them lots of initial references to go look up?
The question is, what control did I have over these projects? I had considerable control. I mean, I did, when I set up the groups, which were in operation by the third week. I would then set aside special office hours to see them. And I would see them at the beginning, and I would usually see them each group I would usually see 3 or 4 times. I'd see them at the beginning when they were searching around, and then I would suggest things for them to read or encourage places for them to look. I did not give them a specific topic, no. And there were, among these groups, there were groups that I thought were making a mistake. And I tried to suggest that, but they wanted to press ahead with secret weapons, or someone was about some spy they had discovered. Well, I let them do it. That might have been a mistake. Actually, after the session was over, I thought it was a mistake. Probably I should have encouraged them to do something else, but they learned. I think they learned.
To go back for a minute, Jim, to the topic of reading and getting them to do it, some faculty feel it helps to give students either more or less directive questions about the material they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that gives them more motivation, helps them know what to concentrate on. Other faculty, thinking that students have to realize things for themselves, don't like to give them any kind of prep in terms of the reading. I'm just wondering where you come down on that.
Okay, Michelle's question was, do I give them questions ahead of time to prepare them for the reading? Do I let them completely on their own? I do not give them study questions. I do not believe in study questions. I usually, at the end of each hour, as we're looking ahead, I usually suggest the general problem of the next week's reading in a 2-minute form. Right? I say, well, now, next week we're going to be reading a novel. Well, we haven't read fiction before, so you've really got to think about what are the particular problems and possibilities that a novelist has that make it different from an autobiography. So that would really be just about it. So I tell them at the beginning of the course how the course is laid out. I tell them my aspirations, and then at the end of the hour I try to prepare them very, very briefly, because I do think that one of the things that is most valuable for a student to see is how much more there was there than he or she realized when they were doing it themselves. That the world is full of things that you must learn to look for and see, and it's always going to take a certain amount of effort to do that. So I always feel it's the study questions, in a way, blunt that mission. I might be wrong, but that's my...
All of us academics have the windbag syndrome, and I'm just wondering how you prevent yourself from, when they ask you a question, well, what about that? That you don't sort of launch into a 5-minute lecture.
The question is, am I a windbag? No. or perhaps the better question is, how do I fight the natural windbag that is in all of us? Well, I mean, obviously, if they ask me a question, I will answer it, but I try to answer it as quickly as I can, and I try not to answer it with a mini lecture. And part of I suppose it's the frustrated windbagginess that is connected to this sense of uneasiness I have about the course. That there's lots more about the First World War that they really should know that they come out of this course not knowing. That's true. But I think it's important, especially at first. I think after maybe towards the end it's less important. I think it's important at first not to let them think that you're going to bail them out. You'll help them. You'll guide them. You've got information, but it is guidance rather than a lecture.
Implicit
Well, sure. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, oh, the question is, am I saying that the seminar form does not lend itself to coverage? And I think certainly in history, that's true, because the seminar must be based, it seems to me at least, on specific texts of one sort or another. And the texts, particularly if they're good texts, are powerful enough that they're going to take it over. And we see this, I mean, those of you who teach IHUM will see this immediately, right? You're in an IHUM discussion, you're teaching Machiavelli. Well, Machiavelli is the 300-pound gorilla. He's going to take that course, he's going to take that discussion over. Now, that's good. But it's going to probably not be the best way to talk about the renaissance of the historical problem, the nature of Florentine society, shifts in international relations in the 1490s, and so forth. You might be able to make some points about that, but that's not really, I think, the best thing the seminar can do.
I think we probably need to wrap up, but please join me in thanking him so much for being here. This is the kind of thinking out loud on teaching, by the way, that we would love to get more faculty involved in, because I think we've seen a wonderful example of how beneficial it is when people will think aloud about their courses.
Thank you.